Hey folks, this is Grim Perspectives, I'm Grim. Today I'd like to talk to you a bit about encounters and how we get the concept of an encounter. But before we do that, I've got a little bit of stuff I wanted just to mention before we start that, and that is what I actually intend to do here. Because as I've published my content on Reddit and other social media, I often come across people saying that I am proposing something as a actual truth that is correct everywhere without stating my presumptions. And what they actually take umbrage with is that I say things that they think aren't true, or at least not true in any in all possible cases, all possible pen and papers, and so they take umbrage with that, and that's fine. But what I actually want to do here is I want to encourage you to find the box that is currently limiting your thinking, because we often have this scope inside of which we are thinking, and it's hard to think beyond that if you don't know that there is actually a box that limits your thinking. So what I like to do here is just make people aware that there is a box. And yeah, take from that what you will. If you don't have a problem with your box and feel fine inside it, that's cool. If that's your niche you want to play in, yeah. But, well, if you know that there's a box, then at least that's an informed decision. Okay, so encounters. Encounters are a funny thing. I didn't worry too much about encounter building for nearly the last 5 years. And then I was asked about joining a podcast this weekend, which, well, the topic is balancing an encounter. And that started me thinking, because balancing encounters is something I didn't really do for 5 years. And why I play pen and paper usually, well, at least once a week, sometimes more than once a week. I have like four sessions at a time where I'm the game master. How come I can get away with not really balancing encounters? That was the question that got me thinking. And I think one of the boxes people don't realize is that they have is closely linked to where we get the concept of an encounter from, and that is chainmail. Maybe you don't know chainmail. Maybe that doesn't ring a bell. But chainmail is what was to become D&D, Dungeons and Dragons. So one of the most influential, if not the most influential, pen and paper game is based on chainmail. What is chainmail? Well, chainmail is a tabletop game. It's not a pen and paper game. It's a tabletop game where you play with miniatures, knights fighting other knights, mounted knights against knights on foot, stuff like that. And chainmail was a rule set to enable you to play a tabletop game. Two armies, two factions facing off each other. And from chainmail, when Gary Gygax and the old crew started playing with chainmail, they did something that was different. They innovated, you might say. So what they did is they didn't just play battles. So I play this battle here, those are my knights, they're gonna fight your knights, whatever. They also came up with the idea that it might be nice that your knight that's standing there is not just, well, some knights with that amount of armor and stuff, but that it's also a character. So it's now Sir Whatnot. And that character is maybe not fighting, well, just because there's a fight here, but there might be something that got him here, and there might be something that links multiple battles he's fighting in. So a story to embed the miniature battles in. And that's the idea that started Dungeons and Dragons. Because you then had characters. with character classes. You then had a storyline. You had a game master, because one of the parties now was no longer just one of two factions, which were, well, more or less the same, but now one side of the table was the player characters, the guys with a name. The other side of the table was the game master, whose job was it to play the opposition. And I think we get much of a way of thinking about pen and paper from that early era, because it's still present in how Dungeons and Dragons work, as an example. And since we are all humans playing pen and paper, we tend to do stuff the way we used to do stuff. So even if Chainmail is quite old by now, once a game master is set in his ways, well, he might change some things, but it's really a long-term process for the community of our hobby to change. So, what might Chainmail have influenced in us that might be limiting our thinking about pen and paper? Well, I've got an idea or two about that. So, we might have relics from Chainmail. Relics, I talked about it before when I talked about linear thinking and linear design for constructing pen and paper campaigns, and that I think linear design is mostly a relic that we take from other things. A relic is something that was present in a different medium, in a different system, and is now dragged into pen and paper because we didn't change it. Not because it's very useful where it is now, but just because, well, we somehow forgot to change it. Or at least we didn't think too much about changing it, maybe. Maybe in your session you want to stay that way. But whatever, a relic, something we need to think about if we want to change it. What are those relics? Well, one is antagonism. The second is combat to death. And the third is limited narrative. And I'll go into a bit more detail about that, those three. So, antagonism. What do I mean by that? Well, Chainmail was set up as a game for two players, for one side to fight the other side. Then one side became characters and was played by more than one party, and the other side still was the game master who had all his monsters. And there is still an element of antagonism in most of our pen and paper games. We tend to think of the game master plays against the players, and the goals of the game master is to make it hard for the players to succeed while playing fair. That's a way of thinking that's still present, I think, in pen and paper. And if you look at more modern takes that try to think differently about it, like Apocalypse World or something like that, then you find phrases like this. Make the player's character's life not boring, and be a fan of your player characters. That's distinctly different to play against the players and play as hard as you can while still playing fair. It's not that you want to make it as hard as possible for them, you want to make their life interesting. Interesting might not be the same as hard as you can. And it's not your job to be against them. You are the character's biggest fan. You like to make them shine in adversity, bring out their facets. You're the guy rooting for your favorite TV series character, and you don't want him to live happily ever after, because that would not make a good show. You want him to be tried and to prove himself. And that's a very different take on the game than that early pre-D&D era thinking. The second point, combat to the death. That's something I think we also took from Chainmail and early D&D. And it comes like this. If you want to set up a battle, and your story is more or less there to justify that battle and to link that battle to a different one that happens afterwards. Then this battle will be fought according to the rules, according to Chainmail rules. So as far as I know, Chainmail didn't really handle morale and stuff like that very well, so combat was usually till death, till one side was wiped out. So the box here seems to be that the game focuses on combat, and the winner of an encounter is who's left alive at the end of the encounter, at the end of combat. And that's pretty weird. On the one hand, you can probably see that there is still that kind of thinking in players and in game masters in our hobby. But on the other hand, if you approach it from a realistic way, if you want narrative realism, even Hollywood realism, then normally people don't start to kill each other without provocation. And if they start to kill each other, they usually have some, if they have a goal and it means they need to, it comes to blows or something like that, then there's usually a point where that stops. And here I'm more liberal, it's not taken word for word from some rulebook, but the goal could also be just make your world seem real. And to build tension and threats and not body piles. Because what happens if you just throw NPCs at your player characters and they kill each other? The game is designed in a way that you shouldn't be the one who wins as a game master, so your NPCs are dead at the end of an encounter. And that just means that, well, that thread of your story is gone. It's gone. You have now a pile of bodies where before some beautiful, well-crafted NPCs could have stood. And if you approach it from another way, see combat as one of the options that might happen in an encounter and not the default option, and craft a narrative so that it allows for, in the beginning, for something else than combat to begin, and in the end, for combat to be resolved not by one party dying, then you can actually make much better use of your time, the time you spend crafting NPCs. The third thing is limited narrative, which we touched on already. The box here is that the story embedding your encounter gives the reason for the encounter and takes over again when all enemies are dead. So the story, the narrative part, is more or less what glues encounters together and the focuses of the combat encounter. I also touched on that when I talked about linear design in pen and paper, because what's also inherent in that is that players are the one who make many decisions, like where should my character move, whom should he attack, what spells can he use in combat, but the narrative part is more or less fixed at those points that link to other encounters. Those need to be fixed, and that makes you very, very susceptible to change. If your story can't really change much with character action, if you need to keep those encounters alive, because, well, if you need to have a life and death fight every encounter, then you don't really have much wriggle room to really adjust your narrative. And you could just say that you want your characters to be human and they want them to have goals and ambitions. And these goals of ambitions will instigate and limit conflict. So if you build an NPC with a goal and ambitions, then those ambitions might clash with the goals of the player characters. And if they do, there might be conflict. That might be just tension, it might be social conflict, it might be violent conflict. But usually, most people aren't willing to die just for anything. So an NPC might have the goal to become the mayor of a town. But is he willing to die for that? Of course not. So if it comes to blows about something like that, it might be that the player characters are opposed to him and that's why the fight happens. But it also means that there is a limit to that conflict. That, well, maybe the NPC decides, okay, I've taken a bloody nose, I've got a cut across my eye. I'm not willing to die for that. And so the conflict is limited in that sense. And, well, that's just my take on what we might have taken from Chainmail without really probably thinking about it. It might be that not all of those really happen in your campaign. And it might be that you think differently about them. Then let me know. I would like to know about that, really. But I think some aspects of that are inherent in most campaigns. And it might be wise to think about them and to give it some thought. Why I did this episode, apart from me thinking that it's something we might want to talk about as a community, is that I've been invited to join the Wild Die podcast this weekend. And for those of you who don't know, the Wild Die podcast is a Savage Worlds podcast. So it deals not exclusively, but mainly with stuff around the pen and paper system Savage Worlds, which I use extensively. And they, well, discuss pen and paper stuff and talk about whatever comes their way. And because one of their guys is at a convention this next weekend, they had to fit in a different topic and they wanted to talk about encounter balancing. And I came across those boxes I told you about. And I thought it might be useful to get that out of the way. Because if we talk about balancing an encounter, you have all those preset things you think about, like an encounter is combat, and combat needs to be like that, and the combat ends when someone is dead, all that stuff. And it really limits your options as a game master. So if you want to know more about that podcast, I'll leave the link in the description. And if you want to join us, the topic again will be encounter balancing. But you know me, I don't do just one thing. I take deep dives and I like to look at what's behind it. And one of the things behind it is that concepts we took, those relics from Chainmail. If you want to listen in, I'll leave the link below. I would really like to see you there. And yeah, maybe some of the guys from that watch the Wild Die podcast will end up here, which would be a cool thing, I think. So, if you like this video, then as always, leave a like. If you want to stay up to date on what we're doing on this channel, then subscribe. And if you know someone who might be interested in what we're doing here, then tell them. I really would like the community we have here to grow so that we can have discussions and stuff on, well, our hobby, our favorite hobby. So, until next time, or until we hear from each other again during the Wild Die podcast, then, well, Grim out.